Have you guys heard of the photographer for a national magazine that he was sent to get photos for this big forest fire? He was told to hurry down to this nearby airport where a plane would be waiting. And when he arrived at the airport, the plane was on the runway warming up, and so he jumped in and he started shouting to the pilot, "Let's go, let's go!" And so the pilot swung the plane into the wind, and pretty soon they were on their way. And the photographer leans over to the pilot and he says, "All right, I want you to make 3 or 4 low-level passes right over the north side of the fire." And the pilot says, "Why would we do that?" And the guy says, "Well, I'm a photographer. I need to get close so we can take good pictures." After a couple of minutes, the pilot said, "You mean you're not the flight instructor?" Yeah, sometimes life doesn't go according to plan, does it? As the old saying goes, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. You know, plans are funny things that most of the time when we make them, you know, we aren't really the ones who control their outcomes. You know, sure, we can do our best to try and make things happen, but so much of our world and our lives are dictated by things outside of our control. You know, we all encounter things in life that aren't supposed to happen, things that weren't really part of the plan. You get a flat tire on the way to work, or your in-laws call or show up unannounced, your teenage daughter gets pregnant, the doctor calls with the worst possible news, the divorce papers arrive. I remember James, when we first hired him, I asked him if he and Thea were planning on having kids. He said, "Yeah, maybe in 10 years. Just when you think you got life figured out, something happens that throws a monkey wrench into your plans. And whether it's the consequences of things we've done or things that are just simply, you know, circumstances beyond our control, suddenly plans change. And sometimes they just totally disappear. But there's a promise, a single promise in God's Word that can meet every surprise or sudden change of plans head on. And given enough time, it'll resolve every problem. It's an ironclad, unfailing, all-encompassing, God-given guarantee that every single circumstance of life will sooner or later work out for the good of God's people. How many of you think that's a promise worth looking into? Buried in the Old Testament book of Jeremiah, a book that we hardly ever read, is this reassuring verse, Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." This is one of those verses that makes it into greeting cards and encouragement cards all the time. It's one that often gets the highly honored name of favorite verse. I have a little gold sailboat in my office that has this verse inscribed on it. It's a verse that's so full of hope that we cling to it like a buoy in the storms of life. And like a precious jewel, this promise is multifaceted, reflecting the many colors of God's grace and sovereignty. And if you'll let me, I'd like to highlight 3 facets of this promise and what they mean to those of us who cling to it. Now, first and foremost, this verse is about God's plan. It's God's plan. Notice the emphasis at the beginning of this verse again. 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you." Where's the emphasis? It's on God. It's His plan, and He's the one that knows it. You know, and our plans and God's plans are often 2 very different things, aren't they? And the Bible is full of stories of people who experience a change of plans. After the glorious exodus from Egypt, the Israelites were supposed to walk into the promised land, this long-awaited home that they had just hoped for. But then after 39 years of wandering in the wilderness, it was clear that things didn't really go according to plan. Mary and Joseph were supposed to get married and start a family and live a pretty quiet, normal life. But then after a visit from an angel who showed up with a mission from above, plans changed. Now, Lazarus was supposed to be healed. I mean, after all, he was a close personal friend of Jesus. But after his sickness took a turn for the worse, suddenly his family realized that plans had changed. And like them, we all have things that didn't work out the way they were supposed to. Often the reason life doesn't go according to plan is that God has other plans. And his plans supersede our plans. And James knows all about that. In the New Testament, he writes to Christians scattered all across the Roman Empire. In James chapter 4, verse 13, he says this, "Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we're going to a certain town and we'll stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while and then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil." See, it's not that all plans are pretentious and bad. Plans can be good, but when our whole life is shaped around our plans, suddenly we become so focused on accomplishing what we want that we lose sight of God and what he wants. Too often our lives are dedicated to serving our own agendas. But as Christians, we're called to accomplish God's goals for us. And when we live our lives trying to achieve expectations that we determine, we put our plans over God's, and our plans kind of become an idol in our life. Sometimes, I think I have such great ideas, and we pray and we want God to bless the plans that we've already made for ourselves. And it's as if we expect God to say, well, Scott, I never thought of it like that. That's genius. We should do that. We actually think we're going to come up with a plan that impresses God and, shows him how smart we are. And the thing about our plans is they can always change, but God never changes. The Bible says in Proverbs 19:21, "You can make many plans, but the Lord's purpose will prevail." No matter what we plan, no matter what we have in mind, God's going to be the one that determines the outcome. The best thing that we can do when looking to the future or when life doesn't go according to plan is to just let God be God. Align your life with his plans. Instead of trying to fit God into our plans, we need to fit into his. Surrendering our plans to him isn't easy. It means learning to let go and accept that I'm not the one in charge. I'm not in control. And sure, we can all make plans about our future, but unless we seek God's will first and align our plans with his, more than likely our plans aren't going to go according to plan. And so first and foremost, this promise is about God's plans, not ours. But furthermore, this promise is about God's people. It's about God's people. Equally important as who forms the plan is who the plan is for. Notice this promise again. God says in Jeremiah 29:11, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." 4 times God says, "I have plans for you." And so the question is, who's the you in this passage? Well, it's God's people. In the original context, these powerful words were part of a letter from the prophet Jeremiah to the Jews who'd been exiled to Babylon. Their beloved city, Jerusalem, had been destroyed, and the people had been carted away from the land. Things couldn't have been much worse for them at this point. Unfortunately, these were the consequences of their own sinful and selfish choices. See, God's people, the kingdom of Judah, disowned him. They sacrificed their own children in the fire to another god, which to me has got to be the most abhorrent sin I could possibly imagine. And so I totally agree with him when God plans to clear the promised land of these despicable people who've been calling themselves by his name and yet living like pagans. They were immoral. They were unjust. They disobeyed God's direct commands. They killed his prophets. They thought that they could get away with their sinful lifestyles without consequences. And finally, after years of putting up with this atrocious behavior, God is ready to bring the hammer down. And so he allows the city to be conquered and its citizens to be captured. But God still had a plan for them because they were his people. And the same is true for us. You know, maybe like the Israelites, you're in a mess of your own making. You know, maybe you've made a series of stupid or selfish choices, and now you're stuck living with the consequences. Or maybe it's not your doing at all. You know, maybe your whole world fell apart through no fault of your own. But in either case, if the context of this passage teaches us anything, it's this. When things seem to be the worst they could ever possibly be, that's when God steps up and says, I've got a plan. He's always got a plan, and he's got a plan for you and for me. It's not just God's people on a whole. You know, it's not just all of Israel or all of Christendom that God has a plan for. It's each person individually. In Psalm 139, David recounts the fact that God created him on purpose. And in verse 16, he says, you saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. What does that mean? It means, first of all, that you are not an accident. And you're not a fluke of nature or the byproduct of astronomical random chance in the universe. Long before you were conceived by your parents, you were conceived in the mind of God. God never does anything accidentally, and he never makes mistakes. He has a reason for everything he creates. Every plant and every animal was planned by God, and every person was designed with a purpose in mind. You were made by God and for God. And until you understand that, your life will just never make sense. It also means that regardless of what you've got written on your calendar, God has an appointment book with your name on it, a schedule that he intends for you to keep. As the wise young Calvin of Calvin and Hobbes fame once noticed, he said, God put me on this earth to accomplish a certain number of things. Right now, I'm so far behind, I'll probably live forever. I think it was about half right. You know, God did put you on this earth to accomplish certain things as part of his plan, his specific plan for you. And even when the world seems like it's falling apart or when you make a mess of things, God has a unique plan for your life. And the best part is, it's a really good plan. Finally, this promise reveals the purpose behind God's plans, God's purpose. And there are certain key words within this promise that highlight God's end game, you know, the purpose behind the plan. The Lord declares one more time in Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope. In short, God's plotting for our good. In all the setbacks, he is ordaining the best for our future. Every event of our day is designed to draw us toward God and toward that destiny. Remember, these words were spoken to displaced, defeated, depressed group of exiles. They had hung their harps on the willow trees and lost their song. They thought there was just no way getting out of this mess. But with the Lord, things are never hopeless. God had a plan for the Israelites to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild their homes, and most importantly, to renew their covenant relationship with God. And in the meantime, and it was a long meantime, it was about 70 years, but in the meantime, they just had to hang in there and cling to God's promise. My kids learned a little bit about that while we were on vacation. And after 2 full days of driving, we finally arrived at our destination in Orlando, Florida. And that first day, you know, we just unloaded the van and put our feet up and didn't do anything. I mean, we were just tired, you know. But the next morning, we loaded the kids back into the van and headed for the beach. Now, Orlando's not on the beach, so we had another hour and 45-minute drive to get to the beach. And the kids did not want to do that. I mean, they whined and complained. They're like, couldn't we just go to the pool in the backyard? What is the big deal about going to the beach? And I told them, guys, just trust me. It's worth it. And it was a harrowing drive through heavy traffic, but the moment we got to the beach, the kids' faces just lit up. And the endlessness of the ocean and the rhythmic crashing of the waves and the white foam splashing at their feet, they were in awe. And I asked them on the way back, I said, so guys, was it worth the drive? And Joshua, my son, said, Dad, it was so worth it. And you know what? Someday you'll say the same thing. Dad, it was so worth it. In the meantime, we have to remember that the journey is worth the destination. No matter how difficult it might be, no matter how many troubles or trials we face, we want to get where we're going. The New Testament reiterates this promise in Romans 8:28. It puts it this way, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. You, in other words, are in the hands of the living, loving God. Your life is a crafted narrative written by a good God working toward your supreme good. He's not making this plan up as He goes. He didn't just wind up the clock and walk away. God's purpose, plan, and promise is to work out the events of human history and your life in particular for the good, to give you hope and a future, an eternity with Christ in His kingdom. Now let's face it, bad things happen, and they happen with unpredictable frequency and varying levels of intensity. Some are mere inconveniences, others are life-shattering disasters. But no matter what happens, we can cling to the promise of Jeremiah 29:11 and trust in God's plans and God's purpose for God's people. Immediately following this promise, God makes a meaningful remark. He tells them in verse 12 through 13, in those days when you pray, I will listen. And if you look for me with all your heart, you'll find me. And so ultimately, God's plan for our lives isn't about prosperity or everything just being perfect and wonderful the way we want it to be. No, His plan is that we would seek Him and know Him and experience His presence in our lives. And so I realize that God does have a plan for my life, and that alone gives me great hope. But when the plan seems difficult, when things just aren't going my way, I'm reminded that His plan for me always revolves around my relationship with Him. And so whatever's going on in my life, His ultimate plan is that I would seek Him with all my heart. So that's my advice, that's my encouragement to you. When life doesn't go according to plan, and even when it does, seek God with all your heart. Trust in His plan for your life. And if I can help you with that, I want to invite you to come talk with me. You can pull me aside after church or talk to me at home, give me a call on the phone, or you can just come forward now while we stand and sing together. Let's sing, church.